Picture a cold medieval winter. Small thatched cottages stand in the snow, their roofs heavy with frost, while thin trails of smoke rise slowly from crooked chimneys. Inside, families huddle close to a crackling fire, the sound of burning logs echoing through the wooden beams. That fire was not just warmth, it was survival. Without firewood, the medieval household had no way to cook, no way to keep the bitter cold at bay, and no way to shape iron in the forge. Firewood was the lifeblood of the medieval village, as essential as bread or water. It kept the soup boiling, the children warm, and the tools strong. But firewood was not easy to come by. There were no chainsaws, no trucks, and no modern storage sheds. So how did ordinary people search for wood, chop it into logs, and store enough to endure the long freezing nights? In the medieval countryside, most villages were surrounded by woodlands. These forests were not just a backdrop of daily life, they were the main source of fuel. Villagers were usually allowed to collect fallen branches, twigs, and dry logs scattered on the forest floor. This deadwood was considered free for common use, and for many families it was the only source of firewood they could rely on. But chopping down live trees was a different matter altogether. Cutting green wood was strictly controlled. Forests technically belonged to the local lord, and peasants needed permission to fell a tree. In some regions, this was completely forbidden, without paying a fee or offering part of the timber as tax. The law made clear distinctions. What nature had already shed could be gathered, but what was still alive in the forest belonged to the manor. Violating these rules could result in fines or even harsher punishments. Because of this, firewood became a daily routine for entire households. Children would roam the edges of the woods with baskets collecting small sticks for kindling. Women often carried bundles of twigs on their backs, balancing them with cloth straps or simple ropes. Men, when permitted, chopped larger branches with axes and carried them back on carts or with the help of animals. Gathering wood was not just a chore, it was a family effort woven into the rhythm of village life. Medieval people relied on the simplest of tools. The axe was the most common used to split thick branches into smaller logs. Small knives or hatchets helped cut twigs and branches, while the frame saw made of wood and a stretched iron blade was used by those lucky enough to own one. These tools were often handed down from father to son, sharpened over and over until the blade grew thin. Nothing was wasted because every tool was a family treasure. Carrying the firewood home was just as important as cutting it. Peasants loaded bundles into handcarts or strapped them onto the backs of oxen when the roads were wide enough. On narrow paths, they carried wood in wicker baskets or tied it into neat bundles and slung it across their shoulders. Children dragged smaller pieces behind them, while women balanced bundles carefully with ropes across their backs. It was exhausting work, but it was repeated day after day. This gathering was rarely done alone. Neighbors often walked into the forest together, chatting while chopping branches, keeping an eye out for wolves or bandits. In the evenings, groups of villagers could be seen returning with their loads, forming long lines of people bent under the weight of wood. The sight was so common, it became part of the rhythm of medieval life. A pile of firewood by the doorway was more than just fuel. It was a sign that the family would eat, stay warm, and endure the long, freezing nights ahead. Once the wood was gathered, the real challenge began keeping it dry. Firewood was usually stacked carefully in tall piles, either in rounded heaps or lined neatly along the outer walls of cottages. The piles were built with care, leaving gaps for air to flow through so the logs could season and lose their moisture. A well-built woodpile was a mark of good planning, and neighbors often judged a family's preparedness by the size and order of their stack. To have no pile was to invite hunger and cold. Protection from the rain was just as important. Villagers would cover the wood with bundles of straw, layers of thatch, or even stretched animal hides if they had them. In some places, simple lean-to sheds were built beside the house, providing a roof where logs could be stacked in rows. The rule was well known: dry wood burns. Hot, wet wood wastes time and fills the house with smoke. Every effort was made to keep the logs ready for the moment they were most needed. Storing firewood was a family task. Children gathered the smaller sticks and tied them into bundles, often laughing as they stacked them higher than themselves. Adults leaned heavy branches against the pile and then tucked straw or brush over the top to shield it from the weather. By the end of autumn, the village lanes were lined with neat wood piles, each one a quiet promise of survival. When the first snow fell, those piles became as precious as gold. Firewood was not gathered at random. It followed the rhythm of the seasons. In summer, villagers took advantage of long days to collect fallen branches and chop wood while the sun dried it. Logs were stacked in open spaces, left to season in the warm air, turning from damp and green to crisp and burnable. The smell of drying wood was as familiar as the hay in the fields, a quiet reminder that winter was always coming. For peasants, every stick gathered in summer meant one less worry in the cold months ahead. Autumn was the true season of preparation. As the harvest came in, so too did the rush to pile up as much firewood as possible. Families worked together, carrying load after load from the forest, knowing that each armful would soon be priceless. The wood piles grew higher and broader, sometimes taller than the children who helped build them. Villagers often measured their safety by the size of their stacks, hoping they had done enough before the first snow arrived. Winter demanded strict discipline. The best logs were saved for cooking and for keeping the central hearth alive through the longest nights. Families often closed off rooms to save heat, gathering around one fire instead of many. The fire was carefully fed, never too much, never too little. Because wasting wood could mean suffering later, it raises a haunting question. Could you survive a medieval winter with only a single pile of wood at your door? In poorer villages, peasants relied on what the forest would freely give. They searched for fallen branches, broken twigs, and scraps of wood left behind after storms. These small collections often meant long hours of labor for only a few bundles of kindling. Families who could not gather enough were forced to burn straw-dried dung or anything that could catch fire. For the poor, survival meant scraping together whatever fuel they could find. The wealthy, however, lived under different rules. Lords and landowners controlled large estates with their own private forests. They could fell whole trees and split them into heavy logs, storing vast piles that would last the entire winter. To them, firewood was not a daily struggle, but another resource managed by their servants. A lord's hall was always bright with fire, while peasants' cottages often shivered in the cold. But wood was more than just fuel. It was a form of currency. Bundles of firewood could be exchanged for food, traded for small favors, or even given as payment for labor. In some places, peasants offered part of their gathered wood as a tax to their lord, alongside grain or livestock. This made firewood a quiet but powerful part of the medieval economy. In many ways, a woodpile was not only warmth for the body, but also wealth for the household. Imagine a medieval kitchen on a winter's night. A pot of soup simmers gently over the flames, sending steam into the low wooden beams. Children sit close to the hearth, their cheeks warmed by the glow, while parents tend to the fire with careful hands. Outside, the world is silent and frozen, but inside, life continues because of one thing: firewood. Without it, there would be no meal, no warmth, and no comfort in the dark. In a world without electricity, without gas, without modern stoves or radiators, firewood was the heartbeat of survival. Those rough bundles of sticks and logs held together entire villages, carrying families through endless winters. Firewood was more than wood. It was food, heat, and hope. So here's the question. If you lived in the Middle Ages, do you think you could chop carry and store enough wood to survive the cold?